everyone. Welcome to the Write Ambitions podcast, where I discuss word usage, grammar, writing, and editing. I'm your host, Jenny Watts. Thanks for tuning in. Today, I'll be talking about some common errors I see when I'm editing fiction and nonfiction. These are things that you can look for when you're doing some self-editing. And the more you look for these errors in your writing, the better you'll be able to recognize them while you're writing, which will make the editing process that much easier. So the first error I see is more of a formatting issue, and it is the divisive one space versus two between sentences debate. If you grew up pre-computers like me, you probably learned to type on a typewriter and to put two spaces in between sentences. And that was correct back then. Today, one space is the norm. Why? Well, typewriters only had one font, and each character took up the same amount of space on the page. So the letter W and the letter L, for example, were the same width, even though a W is wider than an L. So using two spaces in between sentences kind of helped make the text easier to read. But word processing software is able to accommodate not only different fonts, but different character spacing. So it doesn't matter what font you're using, it can accommodate that. So one space is really all that is needed. And one space is also the standard in manuscripts. So most style guides like the Chicago Manual of Style, which is widely used among editors, the Associated Press style book, the American Psychological Association or APA style book, those all advocate one space instead of two between sentences. So if you send your manuscript to an editor, they will change your double spacing to single spacing, and they will probably curse you under their breath while they're doing it. Look, I was a two-spacer for a long time because that's how I learned. It took a while to break the habit, but I did it, and you can too. You can also use the Find and Replace option in Microsoft Word when you're self-editing and replace two spaces with one. So remember, it's one space, not two, in between sentences. Fight me. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about is what I call adjectivitis. So it's the overuse of adjectives. Don't worry, it's not contagious and there is a cure. Many writers believe that adjectives add flavor to the writing and make it more descriptive. And while adjectives are descriptors, they are words that modify or describe nouns, after all. They're not always necessary. Too many adjectives can be distracting for the reader. It falls under the purple prose definition. Purple prose is a term for over-the-top writing. So flowery words, ornate words, hyperbole, 50-cent words, verbosity. There is a time and a place for some of these things, but purple prose should be used sparingly. All things in moderation applies here. Limit your use of adjectives to when they add a key element to your story. For example, if you need to describe the air, you can say the crisp air. It's not necessary to say the crisp, fresh air. Why not? Because crisp air isn't likely to be stale, so the reader can assume it's also fresh. Give your reader the benefit of the doubt. Another thing I see is telling, not showing. It's something I see quite a bit in manuscript editing. Your job as a writer is to take your readers on a journey, to transport them to another place, another time. Your reader needs to be able to visualize what's happening, so your writing needs to show them the way. How do you show instead of tell? By using action words. Telling words are words like felt and seemed. Instead of saying she felt like she needed to be loved, you could say she yearned for love. Or instead of you seem to imply I was wrong, you could simply say you implied I was wrong. When you write, try to elicit your senses. Think about ways you can describe a character, a scene, or an action through sight, sound, touch, scent, or taste. Vivid descriptions that a reader can relate to will help paint the picture in their mind of where you're taking them. One of my favorite writing quotes is from the Russian short story writer and playwright Anton Chekhov. "Don't tell me the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass." That is how you show, not tell, in writing. These next couple of errors I'm going to discuss go along with the telling instead of showing. The first one is instances of providing stage directions for the reader. So what do I mean by that? Let's say your character is having an argument with another character. After they argue, one character leaves the room. Sometimes writers feel the need to write down every action involved with the character leaving the room. He turned, took 3 long steps, turned the door handle, opened the door, and walked out. Ugh, no. It's an argument, right? So your character is probably mad. What do people do when they're mad? Think of action words that describe that. They storm out. They slam the door behind them. There's no need to explain how many steps they took or that they turned the doorknob. A reader can deduce that your character knows where the door is and how to open it. Again, give your reader the benefit of the doubt. Another thing I see is fancy dialogue tags. So using verbs or adverbs to make dialogue tags sound more interesting is another way that writers tell instead of show. I talked about writing dialogue in episode 13, so check that one out. A dialogue tag indicates who is speaking. He said is an example of a dialogue tag. But sometimes writers try to get all fancy and use words other than said in their dialogue tag. "Shane, come back," he cried. Or, "I hear someone in the house," she said quietly. Try something like this instead. Tears streamed down his face. "Shane, come back." The reader knows he's crying and they know who's speaking. Or, "She gripped his arm and froze. I hear someone in the house." That indicates the characters are trying their best to not be heard by whoever is making the noise in the house. Now, there's nothing wrong with using the word said to indicate who is speaking. If you try to replace said with other words, it can get distracting. So remember that you don't have to include a dialogue tag with every line of dialogue also. If it's a back and forth conversation between 2 people, once the sequence is established, the reader will understand who's saying what to whom. Filler words is another thing I see all the time when editing. I talked about this in episode 12 when I discussed how to write more concisely. The error of filler words or inflated phrases is when a writer uses words like really, almost, maybe, probably, generally, actually, very, virtually, things like that. There are better ways to say something is really bad or very good. Think of synonyms for bad and good. Words like awful, repugnant, fantastic, scintillating. Get out a thesaurus if you have to. I recommend it. Who knows? You may learn some new words in the process. I mean, come on, repugnant? That's a word that needs to be used more often in the English language, I think. It's kind of awesome. So inflated phrases are phrases that use more words than necessary to say something. Phrases like due to the fact that. How about just saying because? Or instead of in my opinion, you can just say nothing, because in context, a reader can assume that what is being said by that character is that character's opinion. So it's just not necessary to state that. So follow the KISS mantra. Keep it simple, scribe. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is verb usage and using stronger verbs to get your point across. So weak verb usage was talked about in episode 12 as well. So if you eliminate weak verbs, you can write more concisely and your writing will be stronger. So many times weak verbs translate into passive voice. Sometimes passive voice is fine, but many times active voice can be used in its place and it makes the writing better. So weak verbs usually include forms of to be or to have. You could write, I had a broken foot, or you could write, I broke my foot. And it's more clear. Or I was thinking about the job offer. How about I thought about the job offer instead? And sometimes you just need to break out that thesaurus again and use a verb that conveys the action in a more descriptive way. Take the verb run, for example. Instead of run, we could bolt or race or speed or jet or streak. Make it interesting and engaging for your reader. Another error I see is repetition and redundancy, R&R. Repetition and redundancy are very common in writing. Sometimes they don't even realize, the writers don't even realize that they have a propensity for certain words, and those words just reappear throughout their manuscript. But when you use the same word over and over again, that word starts to stick out. I had this experience several years ago when I read a trilogy that everyone seemed to be reading and talking about. Why this book was so popular, or this trilogy was so popular, I have no idea, because I didn't think the writing was all that great. But I digress. The author used the word clamber repeatedly. She clambered here, and she clambered there, and she clambered everywhere else. It frustrated me to the point where I yelled at the book, "Pick another verb already." Redundancy is also a common error, and it can occur when an author repeats an idea throughout the manuscript. If you're writing and you've already established that the townspeople are hiding a big secret, you don't have to keep reminding the reader that the townspeople are hiding a big secret. But redundancy can happen in other ways too, like when two words are used together but mean the same thing, like basic essentials. The basics and the essentials are the same things, so there's no need to use both words. Pick one. So the last common error that I want to talk about is punctuation. Punctuation marks have a purpose. Exclamation points, for example. Exclamation points are used for emphasis. But sometimes writers end a lot of sentences with exclamation points, but if too many of them are used, the reader becomes desensitized, and it's hard to discern what's being emphasized if everything ends in an exclamation point, right? So you use too many of them, and they end up having the opposite effect, which isn't good. So dialogue that isn't punctuated properly is also an error I see a lot. The punctuation goes inside quotation marks. And quotation marks should be smart quotes, also known as curly quotes. This is a default setting, but if not set properly, the quotes are typed as straight quotes. And again, that's something that editors will fix every time. Other punctuation errors I see include improper use of colons, semicolons, and commas, and improper use of hyphens, em dashes, and en dashes. So these are the common errors that I see when I'm editing. One space versus two, it's always one space. Again, fight me. Overuse of adjectives, filler words and inflated phrases, using weak verbs, getting fancy with dialogue tags, being repetitive and redundant, telling instead of showing, using stage directions, and incorrect use of punctuation. Now, do I expect authors to know all of this? Of course not. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a job. But my job as an editor is to help the authors strengthen their writing and make their manuscript the best that it can be. So I would be remiss if I didn't point some of these things out. So if you can learn to recognize some of these things as you're writing, you'll be able to make your writing stronger, and that will mean I've done my job. So that wraps up this episode. Be sure to check out my other episodes for writing tips and hit the subscribe button while you're there. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.